They yanked him from his seat like luggage tossed in the wrong row. No warning, no reason. Just a 17-year-old black kid dragged down the aisle in front of strangers who refused to meet his eyes. He hadn't spoken out, hadn't disobeyed, hadn't even looked the wrong way. His only offense was the color of his skin and the fact that he didn't fit the picture of who should sit in first class. The air turned sharp with judgment, and as he stood there in silence, stripped of place and dignity, the crew reduced him to something less than human, forcing him into a corner beside the lavatory like a threat to be hidden. People watched. No one spoke. This wasn't a mistake, it was a message. But what they didn't realize was that the boy they tried to vanish wasn't just a passenger. He was a storm they had invited on board, and the reckoning was already buckled in. If that opening shook you, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with where you're watching from. The story that follows will tear apart every assumption you think you're safe behind. Langston Price walked down the narrow jet bridge with the measured steps of someone who had been taught that composure was its own kind of armor. At 17, he looked older than his age, tall, upright, with skin like burnished walnut and a jaw he held stiff when anxious. His hair was neatly combed, and his shirt tucked with military precision. He clutched a black leather duffel with worn handles and a thin boarding pass bearing the number 3A. This flight meant more to him than most. It wasn't just a journey. It was a quiet celebration of his scholarship offer to a prestigious engineering institute. His mother had booked the first-class seat herself. 3 months of extra shifts at the clinic. When he protested the cost, she simply said it was time the world saw him the way she did, dignified, deserving, not squeezed into the back row of someone else's system. As he approached the aircraft entrance, the lead flight attendant glanced at him but didn't speak. Her eyes skimmed his features and returned to her manifest. Langston nodded politely, the way he'd been taught, and moved forward, the edges of his boarding pass crisp in his palm. The first-class cabin gleamed with soft leather seats and gold-threaded carpet trim. Seat 3A was his, window side, left-hand row. But someone was already there. A man mid-50s with a swept-back crown of white hair and a gold signet ring was seated with a newspaper spread open like a wall. Langston hesitated, then checked his pass again. 3A. There was no mistake. He took a step forward. The man didn't look up. The steward, a younger man with buzzed hair and a badge that read Seaberman, approached and gave a short nod. "Sir, I'll take that," he said, extending a hand for the boarding pass. Langston passed it over. The steward glanced at it, then glanced at the seated man. A small wrinkle formed between his eyebrows. "Hold on here a moment," he said, stepping toward the galley. Langston stayed where he was, uncertain, watching as more passengers filed in behind him. The line snaked down the aisle. He was now an obstacle. People began squeezing around him, brushing his shoulder, mumbling apologies. The man in 3A didn't budge. Another steward appeared and murmured something to Berman, who pointed vaguely toward the rear of the plane. "Sir, would you mind stepping aside while we straighten this out?" the second attendant asked. Langston nodded and moved to stand by the galley wall, just out of view from most passengers. A clock above the beverage cart ticked steadily. 3 minutes passed, then 5, then 10. He watched as other first-class travelers were offered drinks, hot towels, and warm greetings. None were asked to wait. A pair of twins no older than 10, wearing matching pink sweaters and white earmuffs, were escorted past him into the first 2 rows. A man in jeans and a hoodie, holding a Starbucks cup, was shown to 3C across from where Langston should have been. Still no answer. When Berman returned, he held a small orange sticker and a folded slip of paper. Without making eye contact, he pressed the sticker onto Langston's shoulder. It was shaped like a triangle, unlike the circular tags the other passengers wore. "Just until we confirm something," he muttered. Langston didn't move. He could feel the shape of the sticker on his shirt, like a spotlight. The paper he was given had no explanation, just his name misspelled and a single letter in the top corner. D. A different flight attendant walked past and paused. Her eyes flicked to the sticker and then away. She said nothing. Minutes later, the boarding door closed. The man in 3A was now sipping sparkling water, and chatting with the woman beside him. Langston remained alone, upright, waiting. "Right this way," said a voice. He turned to see Berman again, gesturing not to his rightful seat, but toward a folding metal jump seat near the rear galley. It faced the lavatories. Langston opened his mouth, but no sound came. "This is temporary," the steward added. "We're just rebalancing the cabin load." Langston walked down the narrow aisle, past rows of turned heads. No one spoke. No one questioned. He lowered himself onto the hard seat. No tray, no legroom, just the antiseptic scent of blue disinfectant and the gentle thud of the lavatory door each time it opened and closed inches from his knees. They clipped him in with a belt that fit too snugly, digging across his hips. The sticker on his shoulder still itched. A pair of attendants whispered nearby, glancing in his direction once before looking away. When drinks were served, they passed his seat without acknowledgement. Langston pressed the call button once. No one came. A half hour into the flight, a clipboard was passed through the cabin. It bore a checklist of names, rows, and designations. His name was not there. Neither was his seat. The clipboard was returned to the cockpit without correction. The overhead announcement welcomed passengers to the flight, acknowledged a celebrity seated in row 2, and reminded travelers to enjoy the complimentary champagne. No mention of the boy in the rear jump seat. Langston sat still, the muscles in his jaw tight, his gaze locked on the back wall. He could hear the hum of the engines and the occasional clatter of icing glasses. When the cart finally approached his corner, one of the newer attendants, a man with dark eyes and a clipboard, paused. Without making eye contact, he slipped a folded note onto Langston's lap and continued pushing the cart forward. The note was typed on a plain slip of airline-branded paper. It read only, "You are being observed. Stay cooperative." There was no signature, no explanation, just a vague implication that turned his stomach to stone. Langston glanced around the cabin, but saw no one watching him. Not clearly. The people nearby were either asleep or purposefully ignoring his presence. Across the aisle, a toddler peeked at him from over a seatback before being pulled gently out of view by her mother. He folded the note, tucked it under his thigh, and sat straighter. As the plane hummed across cloud banks, a new flight attendant approached. This one wore a red-accented neck scarf and a name tag that read J. Rowland. She crouched slightly in front of him with a smile that didn't quite touch her eyes. Without asking permission, she reached into the seat pocket beside him and pulled out a safety card. It looked normal at first glance, but when Langston studied it more closely, he saw something off. The illustrations had been altered. The cartoon passengers depicted in the emergency exit instructions had exaggerated features. Wide eyes, frizzy hair, a too dark skin tone that was almost caricature. In one panel, a stick figure was being forcibly removed by crew during a fire evacuation. His seat safety card was the only one like it. He had seen the others in the main cabin earlier. Plain, unmarked, procedural. J. Rowland smiled again and slipped it back into place. "Regulations," she said before walking off without another word. He sat in stunned silence. The implication wasn't just that he was different. It was that he was unsafe, unworthy, and expendable. Minutes later, a request came through the intercom for a mid-flight documentation check. Passengers were asked to have ID ready, an unusual request, given that the plane was already at cruising altitude. The check passed swiftly through the main cabin and first class, conducted with casual glances and quiet nods. When the steward reached Langston, however, the process took a different turn. Berman returned, flanked by a second crew member with a handheld scanner. Langston handed over his boarding pass and state ID. They examined both under a pocket UV light, flipping them repeatedly, as if expecting to uncover some fraud hidden in the ink. Then Berman pulled out a disposable glove and slipped it on slowly before reaching out to pat down Langston's pockets. Langston stiffened but didn't resist. The entire cabin could see the examination. Every press of the steward's hands, every touch along his shirt seams, belt line, and shoes was deliberate and slow. His breath grew shallow. The crew said nothing as they finished. No apology, no explanation, just a glance between them Then a curt nod. As they walked away, Langston noticed a change. The other passengers were no longer pretending not to see him. They were watching now, some with curiosity, some with suspicion, none with empathy. One woman across the aisle clutched her purse tighter. A man diagonally ahead turned in his seat to get a better look. Whatever had just been done to him, it had altered the entire cabin's perception. He was no longer a student. He was a problem. The seatbelt light flickered on, and the pilot's voice came over the intercom announcing mild turbulence ahead. Langston remained braced, not for the movement of the aircraft, but for the next blow. He felt it coming, like the cold before snow. The next indignity arrived in the form of a stewardess carrying a laminated form on a clipboard. She handed it to him with the efficiency of someone delivering a utility bill. The form was titled Passenger Conduct Evaluation. It listed vague behavioral categories like unruly, disruptive, defiant, and other. There were checkboxes beneath each. At the bottom, it read, Passenger Acknowledgement Required. Langston looked up at the woman. She gestured at the bottom of the page with a pen. Just sign, she said. Her tone was flat, like she'd asked the same of dozens before. Protocol. He hesitated, then signed. His hand shook slightly. As soon as he finished, she tore the top sheet off the pad, folded it neatly, and slipped it into her apron. The cabin lights dimmed for evening service. Outside, the sky turned copper, fading into slate. The curtain to first class remained closed. No one crossed it. The flight crew stopped responding to his call button. One of the crew passed him by and laid a folded packet beside him. Inside were airline training materials, photocopied articles on de-escalation, in-flight threat assessments, and case studies with titles like Spotting Warning Signs. On the last page, a hand-drawn arrow pointed at a stick figure wearing a triangle sticker. The caption read, Watch closely. He dropped the packet to the floor. He wanted to disappear. He wanted to scream. But he stayed where he was, because that was what he had been taught. To survive, you endure. You blend. You wait. The laminated conduct form he'd signed remained out of sight, folded away in a steward's apron like a sealed verdict. The weight of the triangle sticker on his shoulder grew more pronounced with every passing second. No longer a temporary label, but a scarlet letter that drew the crew's attention like a trigger. When the overhead speaker chimed again, the voice was different, not the captain's usual clipped baritone, but a woman's voice, slow and practiced. Select passengers may be asked to participate in in-flight behavior support programming. Please cooperate with crew requests. Langston barely reacted anymore. He simply stared ahead, past the emergency exit sign, past the beverage tray that hadn't rolled his way, past the second curtain that sealed him off from everything he was supposed to be part of. Minutes later, the red-scarved attendant returned. She carried with her a black vinyl folder and a tablet, which she placed into Langston's lap without explanation. The folder contained a checklist titled Passenger Temperament Index. There were sections to rate one's own performance, responsiveness, emotional control, obedience, and predictability. Langston flipped the pages slowly, struggling to understand what this was. Part of our internal program, the attendant said without inflection. Just fill it out. She tapped the tablet screen, which now displayed a looping video showing a passenger being redirected calmly by a steward in a fabricated training scenario. The passenger in the video resembled Langston just enough to make his stomach twist. Same build, similar complexion. Even the same orange triangle visible on his jacket sleeve. He glanced at the paper checklist again. The final question read, "Do you consider yourself a manageable individual?" Langston filled in each blank in small, neat letters. He answered honestly, though it cost him. After he handed the papers back, the attendant didn't respond, only slipped the documents back into the vinyl folder and walked away. 30 minutes later, a second directive came. Berman returned and gestured for him to unclip his belt. "Cabin observation session," he said, his tone clipped. Langston followed him, walking slowly through the rear aisle, while passengers turned their heads away. Some pretended to sleep. Others stared through him. He was led to a narrow service corridor between the galley and the lavatory, where a folding chair had been set up facing a mounted screen. The screen flickered to life, displaying real footage of various cabin interactions, confrontations, misunderstandings, acts of passive resistance. There was no sound. Langston sat as instructed, and without prompting, the screen began cycling through the clips. He watched one after the other. In one, a woman refused to store her bag in the overhead bin. In another, a man refused to fasten his seatbelt. In the third, a young boy sat crying as a steward argued with his father. After 5 minutes, the screen went dark, replaced with a message. Response evaluation pending. Langston looked around. No one was monitoring him directly, but he sensed eyes watching from the curtain slits or the cockpit camera. A crew member returned and handed him a blank page. Describe the behavior in each clip and how you would have responded. The test was not optional. He wrote quickly, not trusting himself to linger on any one scene. He chose neutral, precise language. After 15 minutes, the paper was taken and he was allowed to return to his jump seat. He found a folded airline blanket waiting for him, gray and scratchy. It was positioned awkwardly across the seat, half draped like a flag. Inside it was a small, unmarked packet containing 2 pills labeled only ComAid. A note beneath it read, "Optional supplement for passenger comfort." He didn't take them. The plane had begun its nighttime descent toward their layover city. Soft blue lights glowed along the aisle, and the cabin fell into a hush. But Langston could not sleep. Even if he closed his eyes, the tension in his neck would not allow peace. When he shifted, the seatbelt bit into his side. The tray with the restraint kit had been removed, but the absence was not relief. It was just space where humiliation had sat. A few rows ahead, a steward whispered to a passenger while gesturing back in Langston's direction. The passenger nodded slowly, then turned to stare. Later, the steward returned, carrying a new laminated form titled Cabin Influence Factor. It required Langston to list how his presence might have impacted the emotional climate of those seated nearby. There was no correct answer. The question was a snare. He wrote as carefully as he could, each word a negotiation between honesty and survival. After collecting the form, the steward reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a cloth patch. It bore a symbol he didn't recognize, 2 interlocked arrows, and pinned it to Langston's lapel without asking. Endorsed observation status, the steward said quietly, then left. Langston now bore 3 separate markers, the triangle, the patch, and the memory of every passenger's gaze. The humiliation was no longer just action. It was becoming identity. Near midnight, the captain announced weather delays at their connecting hub. The plane would be rerouted to a smaller, less active airfield for refueling. The announcement was followed by a quiet exchange among the crew. A shadow moved near the cockpit curtain. Someone in a dark uniform, not part of the original cabin team, stepped out, glanced once toward Langston, and ducked back behind the cockpit door. The steward handed Langston another envelope. The captain's voice came on with carefully chosen words, announcing an unscheduled pause due to weather congestion at the main hub. The explanation sounded rehearsed, dispassionate, and too mechanical to question. Moments later, without fanfare, a metal staircase was rolled to the rear service door, the same door closest to Langston's isolated seat. The seal broke with a hiss, and chilled air drifted into the cabin. 2 men in reflective jackets stood outside, their features obscured by wind and shadow. They did not speak. They simply waited. A steward moved toward Langston with a thin white folder and handed it over without a word. The folder contained a form labeled Emotional Accountability Survey, with checkboxes next to questions like, have you raised your voice during this flight? And have you created visual discomfort for fellow passengers? Langston did not move. He sat with the form in his lap, staring at the rows of absurd inquiries until the steward crouched beside him and whispered that this document was to be signed in the presence of airfield staff. The term staff echoed in his ears like a misfired warning. He was guided down the steps alone while passengers remained in their seats. No explanation was given. The floodlights turned the tarmac into a surreal stage, and every echo of his footfall was swallowed by distance. He followed the two men in reflective jackets to a waiting van parked beside the fuel truck. The van door opened without ceremony, revealing a narrow metal bench bolted to the floor and a clipboard resting on a hook near the door. Langston sat inside, the metal cold through his slacks. One of the men stepped in behind him, holding a small device resembling a breathalyzer and a thick rubber stylus. The man asked Langston to recite his full name and to breathe slowly into the device. He obeyed, keeping his voice even, his breathing steady. The device beeped and recorded his response. The man wrote something on the clipboard, then asked Langston to describe the events of the flight in his own words, but only using adjectives. No names, no places, no verbs. Langston blinked, confused. The man did not explain further. He simply waited. Langston said, quiet, tense, uncomfortable, cold, humiliating. The man made a mark next to each word and nodded. He then pulled a camera from the dashboard, clicked a photo of Langston, and returned to the airfield terminal. Langston sat alone in the van for nearly 20 minutes. No one spoke to him. No one explained why this was happening. When the door opened again, it was a different steward, one Langston hadn't seen before. He wore a tie with a pin that looked like two wings wrapped in a coil. He handed Langston a new folder, thicker than the last. This one contained an amended itinerary. His connection flight had been changed. His seat assignment was now labeled discretionary. There were no row numbers, no gate, no arrival time. The word pending was written over the location in faded blue ink. Langston asked quietly if this was temporary. The steward simply nodded once, closed the folder, and gestured for him to return to the aircraft. As he re-entered the plane, passengers looked up, then quickly down again. He was not met with hostility. He was met with practiced avoidance. The type that tells a person they have become a symbol of something others would rather not name. He returned to the same jump seat beside the lavatory. A different blanket now rested across it, folded into a perfect square with a small paper tag pinned to the corner. The tag read, "Sanitized for secondary use." He sat, buckled in, and wrapped the blanket around his knees. The door sealed behind him again, the aircraft vibrated slightly, and the engines began to hum. They were airborne once more. As the plane climbed, Langston received a final set of instructions. An attendant placed a notepad in his lap with the words passenger adjustment log printed across the top. He was told to record his thoughts every 20 minutes until landing. No prompts, no themes, just stream of consciousness journaling. It was described as a trust-building activity. Langston opened the notepad. The pages were numbered, lightly watermarked with the airline's insignia. He picked up the attached pen and wrote the time. Then he sat still. After 20 minutes, he wrote again. One word, still. At the next interval, he wrote, noticed. At the third, watched. By the fourth entry, his words slowed. He no longer felt like he was documenting his thoughts. He felt like he was reporting to someone he had never met, someone with rules he did not understand. The crew took the notepad at the end of the exercise, nodded with approval, and walked away. He didn't ask where it was going. Later, a new voice came over the speaker. This time it was not the captain, but someone from the airline's passenger relations department. They thanked him for his compliance. They asked him to remain calm and follow further instructions. A steward arrived carrying a soft case, unzipped it, and presented him with a blue vest. The words passenger under consideration were embroidered on the back. He was asked to wear it during the remainder of the flight. He slid it on slowly. It smelled faintly of plastic and ammonia. The vest fit too snug across the chest. Every movement now felt like a display. With the vest in place, the crew asked him to walk once down the aisle and return to his seat. They referred to it as a movement calibration. He obeyed. Each step felt like a spotlight. No one spoke to him. A baby whimpered. A man near row 9 cleared his throat loudly. When he returned to the rear, a camera blinked red from a corner mount near the galley. Everything in him had contracted inward, a coiled reaction to the string of subtle humiliations and invented procedures that had transformed a simple journey into a slow erasure of self. He hadn't seen a clock, hadn't tracked the flight path, and no one had spoken his name in hours. He existed as a category now, a file under review, a subject undergoing adjustment. But even that quiet had its limits. At the midpoint of the flight, a soft chime rang out through the cabin, followed by a voice with cheerful rhythm announcing a special mid-flight recognition ceremony. Passengers turned toward the front of the aircraft, where the curtain to first class had been tied back, revealing a small, makeshift podium formed from a flipped-over beverage cart. A steward stepped forward holding a silver pin shaped like the airline's logo, flanked by 2 attendants clapping gently. "We are delighted," the voice said, "to present this month's Model Flyer Award to a valued traveler whose respect, positivity, and cabin etiquette inspire us all." The applause was hesitant but real. Langston could not see the recipient at first, but the man who rose from row 5 had a powerful stride, neatly combed blonde hair, and a navy sport coat with a folded handkerchief. He smiled wide as the steward pinned the award on his lapel. As he bowed his head slightly for the photo, he turned just enough to look back toward Langston, his eyes briefly meeting Langston's with a glint of amusement. Langston recognized him immediately. It was the same man who had earlier stared during his cabin walk, the same one who had loudly cleared his throat and shifted away in exaggerated disapproval. The man had barely spoken a word since boarding, yet now he stood in the aisle being applauded for his model behavior. Langston's stomach tightened. The cabin crew resumed their rounds with renewed energy, beaming smiles, and complimentary drinks for those seated near the honored guest. The captain even issued a congratulatory note over the intercom, calling the man by name. Meanwhile, Langston remained unmoved, vest clinging to him like armor made from shame. Not long after the ceremony, Berman returned to Langston's corner holding a small silver envelope with his gloved hand. It was presented with unnecessary care, like a wedding invitation. Inside was a card with ornate lettering that read, "Adjustment review completed. Passenger performance marginal. Reassignment pending." There was a handwritten number at the bottom, 0.4. No context, no scale, just the digit, circled in red ink. Langston stared at the card without blinking. There was nothing to sign, nothing to dispute. It was not a warning, not a reprimand. It was a pronouncement. The envelope was taken from him almost immediately. The crew now moved with mechanical confidence, as if the process had shifted into its next phase. A storage compartment near the lavatory opened, and from it, Berman retrieved a small plastic crate labeled Miscellaneous Provisions. From inside, he removed an article of clothing, an old airline employee jacket from a discontinued uniform series. It was 2 sizes too large, faded gray with shoulder seams that drooped. Without a word, the crew unfastened the vest Langston wore and replaced it with a jacket. The tag had been removed, the sleeves slightly frayed. It smelled faintly of mildew and something chemical. "You've been reassigned to provisional staff," a new steward said, with the same calm tone one might use to deliver a safety reminder. "We appreciate your flexibility." No eye contact, no trace of irony. Langston stood slowly, the jacket swallowing his frame, and was directed toward a fold-out panel near the galley, now designated as his station. A clipboard was hung nearby, with a sheet titled Galley Hygiene Observation Chart. His name, now spelled incorrectly as L. Price, had been added at the bottom in faint pencil. Over the next hour, he was directed to monitor trash levels in the service carts, count unused creamer packets, and report the temperature on the cabin refrigerator readout every 10 minutes. Passengers occasionally glanced back, puzzled, but no one spoke to him. He moved slowly, deliberately, without resistance. He wasn't sure if he was pretending anymore. Somewhere in the haze of instructions and shifting expectations, he had stopped asking himself if these tasks were real. When turbulence struck unexpectedly, the crew responded quickly, latching down carts, checking belts. Langston reached to steady one of the service trays, and a nearby attendant snapped at him to return to his station. He obeyed. A minute later, she returned and handed him a towel with a small brown stain in the center. "Cabin incident," she said. "Clean it." He took it. The location wasn't explained. He wiped a patch of the wall near the rear lavatory. She took the towel back and offered no thanks. Later, the same steward who had delivered the reassignment jacket returned with a new sticker. This one green, rectangular, with a barcode and the words "Limited Service Role" written in pale lettering. It was affixed to the upper left chest of his borrowed jacket. His reflection in the galley's stainless steel drawer showed him someone else entirely. Blank stare, oversized coat, colored sticker, sunken shoulders. At last, a final form arrived, presented on a clipboard with a pen dangling from a cord. The form was titled Passenger Integration Index Summary. It featured checkboxes under headers like role acceptance, predictability in assigned tasks, emotional containment, and willingness to relinquish autonomy. Langston signed the bottom with a hand that barely shook. The form was collected without acknowledgement. The crew gathered quietly near the galley curtain, conferring over something he couldn't hear. One of them nodded, then glanced back at Langston, nodding again. From a nearby seat, the man who had won the Model Flyer award leaned his chair back and chuckled softly. No new instructions had come. No apologies. No acknowledgement. Just silence. The message was clear. He had not been reintegrated. He had simply been removed from function, left to exist in a suspended role no longer officially sanctioned, but still separate from those allowed to sit in normal seats, eat warm meals, or speak without scrutiny. He could hear the first-class passengers just beyond the curtain. Their voices rose and fell in soft tones, discussing business, family, travel plans, and jokes they whispered among themselves. Occasionally, a gust of perfume or the clink of a fresh glass of wine reminded him of what the front of the plane still offered to those unburdened by suspicion. Langston's tray table, if it could be called that, was no more than a fold-down steel panel smeared with a forgotten fingerprint and a dry drop of cranberry juice. The seat's armrest had been removed, allegedly for repairs, leaving his right side exposed to the aisle and the constant brush of flight attendants' uniforms as they passed without stopping. The lavatory door beside him continued to open and close every few minutes, its light flickering just enough to remind him that he sat closest to a space no one wanted to acknowledge. When a passenger exited and made brief eye contact with him, they always turned quickly away, as if looking too long would create an obligation they weren't willing to accept. Langston had stopped trying to adjust his position for comfort. His back ached from the unnatural curve, but he knew any movement might be misinterpreted. Without warning, a crew member approached with a new object in hand, a small, faded pillow, still wrapped in its original packaging. She held it out to him like a donation, her eyes not quite meeting his. He took it silently and placed it on his lap, though the plastic wrapping had not been removed. Inside, a slip of paper was folded tightly, taped to the pillow's tag. He unwrapped it with care. It read, "Temporary status verified. Remain in provisional position until clearance confirmed." The handwriting was the same cursive script he had seen on the last form. The ritual continued. Another steward arrived, this one carrying a handheld barcode scanner. He pointed it at Langston's chest, where the green sticker still rested. The device beeped softly. The steward gave a single nod and walked away. No questions, no directives, just a brief confirmation that he was still flagged, still monitored, still cataloged. Langston wondered if that scan had updated a database somewhere, marking him with a new code or label. He began to imagine files being created in real time, digital records tracking his posture, his compliance, the number of words spoken per hour. Perhaps there was already a risk assessment tagged with his initials. Soon after, a laminated card was slipped under his tray panel. It bore a new title, Contingent Relocation Candidate. The list of instructions below, it stated that should an emergency require cabin reorganization, he was expected to relocate without delay or protest to any seat or location designated by the flight crew, including cargo areas or staff quarters. The final line instructed him to acknowledge this by remaining seated and compliant for the remainder of the flight. He folded the card and slid it into his jacket pocket, unsure if that act alone would be reported. Across the cabin, a seat opened. A family had moved forward into upgraded rows, leaving one empty seat in row 16, visible from where he sat. No one invited him to take it. The seat remained empty for more than an hour. A steward walked past it twice, never glancing his way. At one point, a woman with an infant asked if she could be moved to that row for more space. She was told the seat was unavailable. Langston said nothing. He did not volunteer. He understood the message. That seat wasn't empty. It was preserved, not for use, but to create absence. The final humiliation arrived quietly. During the third beverage service, the attendants moved from passenger to passenger, offering a choice of drinks and warm snack boxes. When they reached the last row, one attendant leaned in and held out a pre-packaged box without a label. It was smaller than the others, plain white, sealed with a strip of masking tape. Inside was a dry bun, 2 wrap crackers, and a single packet of margarine. No utensils, no napkin, just a plastic cup of water balanced on top. The attendant said nothing. Langston took it and placed it on the tray without opening it. The box stayed untouched. Hunger warred with dignity, and for now, dignity remained intact. He couldn't bring himself to eat a meal that had been designed to communicate contempt. Later, a crew member returned to collect trash. She pointed at the unopened box. He nodded once. She took it away without a word. As she turned, a small folded napkin fell from her apron pocket onto his tray. Before she could retrieve it, he saw what had been written in pen on the inner fold. Review score, 2.2, declined reintegration. Below that, someone had drawn a small triangle, circled in black. He had stopped hoping for change. He simply existed within the boundaries they had designed. His presence reduced to a quiet figure without definition or direction, unseen and unmanaged but never free. Until something shifted. It began with a small mistake. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake at all. Maybe it was the moment the system began to falter under the weight of its own construction. A steward in a navy vest approached the galley wall carrying a tablet. His eyes fixed on the passenger manifest, displayed in clean, digital rows. He moved through the economy cabin first, pausing occasionally to tap his screen and adjust the record for a traveler who had changed seats or declined a meal. Then he reached the rear of the plane, squinting at the tablet, hesitating just long enough to signal something was wrong. Langston noticed a change in the man's posture, the slight furrow of his brow as he cross-referenced the names with the physical presence of passengers in each row. He looked up, scanned the lavatory seat, glanced down again, then looked back at Langston with a faint expression of confusion. The steward said nothing. He turned the tablet slightly away, typed something, then walked briskly to the front of the cabin. The curtain between first class and coach fluttered as he disappeared behind it. Minutes passed. Langston remained still, alert now, but expressionless, unwilling to give away the hope that something, anything, might be happening. A new crew member emerged, this one wearing the insignia of a senior officer, silver wings over a black shirt. He held a leather binder, not a tablet, and he moved with the deliberate authority of someone who believed in their own rank. He stopped directly in front of Langston's seat and crouched slightly to meet him eye to eye. Without asking, he reached for the barcode on Langston's jacket and scanned it with a small handheld reader. The device chirped once, then went silent. The man checked the screen, frowned, and looked again at Langston. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The crewman stood, opened the leather binder, flipped through several laminated pages, and then paused. His finger tapped the air above a row on the manifest. He looked back at Langston with an expression that hovered somewhere between suspicion and surprise. Then slowly he spoke. "You're not on here." His voice was quiet, calculated, and slightly disbelieving. Langston said nothing. The man tilted the tablet toward him. The manifest had every name, every seat assignment, every row. His name, Langston Price, was nowhere. Not in first class, not in economy, not in the updated logs with crew notes. His boarding pass, his ID, his printed ticket, all of it had vanished. He didn't just lack status, he lacked existence. He had become a ghost in the machine. The man walked away without another word. A flurry of movement followed. Attendants gathered in the galley, whispering in tightly controlled voices, occasionally glancing back at Langston's seat with wide, uncertain eyes. Something had gone wrong, not with him, but with the system that had tried to disappear him. 10 minutes passed, then 15. A quiet alert rang out over the internal crew channel. The cockpit door opened briefly, and one of the pilots conferred with a uniformed officer holding a different tablet. Langston heard the word security. He heard the word review. But the words that truly reached him were softer, spoken behind the curtain by the same steward who had escorted him off the plane hours ago. There's no record of his check-in. His ticket's not in the system. It's like he was never supposed to board. Another replied, and yet he's here. That second voice carried something new. Not hostility, not confusion, but something closer to fear. The plane was no longer just a vehicle in motion. It had become a sealed chamber in which every protocol, every line of authority, had been followed to the letter to control a passenger who, by the system's own admission, did not officially exist. Someone had made a grave error, or someone had tried to cover one up. The crew didn't know what to do. Removing Langston midair wasn't an option. The performance of order they had maintained was unraveling, thread by thread, as they realized they had no legitimate record of their target. Every humiliation, every reassignment, every form and sticker had been predicated on a foundation that didn't exist. In the control room of the aircraft's data center, a secure tablet accessible only to the lead steward, a digital override protocol was initiated. A login screen appeared with a challenge code marked Priority Alpha. It was entered manually. A new file loaded. Langston's name appeared, but not in the passenger manifest. Not in the behavior evaluation list. Not in the service adjustment queue. His name appeared under a separate heading, Internal Clearance Protocol Executive Passenger Confidential. The file required a biometric confirmation to open. It bore a seal from Crestline Aviation Group. Langston's last name matched the primary emergency contact of a high-level defense aviation executive listed in the aircraft's mechanical ownership chain. His identity had been scrubbed from public access by design. His seat assignment had been rerouted through a private security channel for undisclosed passengers under confidential travel arrangements. He was never meant to be identified by normal staff. He was never meant to be relocated. His position on the aircraft had been secure under protected protocol until someone overrode it without proper authorization. That someone was now being tracked. One of the steward supervisors turned pale and quietly excused herself to the front of the aircraft, where she placed a call from the cockpit comms line to a secure ground liaison. Her voice was trembling. Langston remained still. He had heard none of this, but he could feel it in the crew's shift, the hesitation in their walk, the widening gap between actions and instructions, the absence of condescension replaced by a fearful kind of calculation. The sticker on his jacket was no longer an authority. It had become a liability. The crew began removing items from the wall near his seat. A small clipboard with behavior notes was tucked discreetly into a trash liner. A laminated compliance flowchart was peeled from the emergency door and quietly shredded in the galley shredder. A steward unpinned the barcode from Langston's chest and folded the jacket sleeve over it. The illusion of control they had used to sculpt his identity into a disposable role had shattered against a single oversight. His presence had never belonged in the system they thought governed the cabin. He wasn't on the manifest because his name had been sequestered under protected classification, a designation reserved for individuals whose identities were shielded due to strategic or confidential affiliations. That protection, buried deep within the back end of the aircraft's operating system, had been designed to keep high-risk or high-value passengers anonymous in the event of a security breach. Now that protection was exposed, and it painted every action taken against him in damning light. The air no longer felt like recycled comfort. It felt like anticipation. The steward who had scanned his jacket no longer hovered nearby. He had been called to the forward section of the plane for what the intercom vaguely referred to as procedural realignment. Another flight attendant, this one younger, with wide eyes and shaking hands, walked past Langston's seat twice before finally stopping. Without speaking, she reached down and picked up the unused meal box she had handed him hours ago, still sealed, still untouched. She cradled it like a fragile piece of evidence, then backed away without apology. Moments later, a ripple of movement reached Langston's peripheral vision. The first-class curtain opened slightly, and a woman stepped through, escorted by a crew member. She was not part of the standard cabin crew. Her attire marked her as a corporate observer, one of the faceless executives who occasionally boarded under titles like compliance auditor or procedural consultant. Her badge bore a single character, C. She didn't speak to Langston. She didn't acknowledge the jacket or the missing barcode or the discomfort etched into his posture from hours in a seat meant for temporary use. She merely observed him, eyes scanning the details, the frayed edge of the assigned jacket sleeve, the indentation on his forearm from prolonged contact with the seat's metal restraint, the slow, even breath of someone who had learned to survive by surrendering movement. After a minute, she turned and walked away. The captain's voice returned to the cabin, this time less formal, stripped of the composure that had defined each earlier announcement. He announced an upcoming unscheduled landing at the aircraft's original destination, stating only that a review of procedural inconsistencies had necessitated the adjustment. The word inconsistencies echoed softly, carrying with it the weight of buried confession. No one applauded. No one questioned. The passengers, perhaps sensing the discomfort behind the crew's attempts to maintain order, grew quieter, their voices tapering to whispers as the plane began its slow descent. A steward appeared once more, holding an envelope, not silver this time, but pale cream, heavier, embossed with a seal that Langston recognized not from travel, but from home. It bore the insignia of Crestline Aviation's executive division. The steward's hand shook as he handed it to Langston, and for the first time, he looked him in the eyes. Not with disdain, not with irritation, but with fear. Langston took the envelope, slid his finger beneath the seal, and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper printed in bold, formal script. To Langston Keaton Price, it read, "This aircraft, its resources, and its personnel have been placed under your protection due to your status as a Tier 1 dependent of Executive Officer Maura Keaton Price. All operational decisions concerning your welfare and placement on board this flight fall under Federal Civil Air Executive Code 27-6A. You are not subject to standard crew directive. Any failure to comply with this protection code will be reviewed by federal oversight within 24 hours of aircraft landing." The statement was undersigned by 3 names, 2 from Crestline's executive board and 1 from a federal transportation office. Langston reread the line about his mother's name. The last time he had spoken to her before this flight, she had told him gently, as only a mother could, that she had moved every obstacle out of his way for this journey, that he would arrive in comfort, safety, and anonymity, that he wouldn't have to prove he belonged. Now, her protection had arrived not in the kindness of strangers, but in the quiet collapse of the system that had ignored her authority. One by one, the artifacts of his degradation were stripped away. The provisional jacket was collected with a whispered apology. The sticker, now barely clinging to the sleeve, was removed by hand. The empty tray table was scrubbed down, the surrounding area disinfected as though to erase evidence. Langston was not asked to move. He was not offered a new seat. The crew understood. No gesture could undo what had been done. A formal acknowledgement over the intercom declared a procedural reassignment review had been initiated. Nothing more. The words meant nothing to the passengers, but the tone meant everything. Langston looked forward, toward the curtain now parted slightly at the center, a narrow path toward the part of the plane that had once been closed to him. No one blocked his view now. No one stood between him and the aisle. But he did not move. Movement was not necessary. Presence was enough. From the forward cabin, the woman with the badge marked C returned once more, this time accompanied by the captain himself. The two approached slowly, carefully, with the stillness of those who understand they've been seen by someone they thought invisible. The captain cleared his throat, but no words came. He extended his hand. Langston did not take it. Instead, he folded the envelope once, tucked it into his jacket, and looked straight ahead. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. The woman leaned down and whispered something to the captain. They stepped back and disappeared through the curtain. Behind Langston, the galley lights dimmed. The seatbelt sign illuminated. The landing began. The crew stood just outside the galley as he passed, none of them daring to speak. The woman with the sea badge remained beside the captain, clipboard in hand, her fingers gripping the metal, as though afraid it might fly from her grasp. She didn't look up. The captain lowered his head slightly, a gesture that landed somewhere between apology and submission. Langston walked past them all. No one followed. In the terminal, an agent waited by the security gate holding a tablet and a badge clipped to his chest that read Aviation Oversight Division. He didn't smile. He simply extended a hand toward Langston and gestured him to a side corridor shielded by frosted glass. The hallway led to a private briefing room designed for passengers under special classification. Langston took a seat in the center of the room. The door remained open. He didn't need to be told that this wasn't an interrogation. This was a reckoning. Moments later, the agent who had greeted him returned with two others. They entered without ceremony and began laying out folders. No names were spoken. No introductions were made. The files were placed across the table in sequence, each marked with a corresponding timestamp from the flight: boarding, seat reassignment, behavior evaluation, provisional duty issuance, safety drill participation, meal distribution, and final compliance form. Langston recognized each moment, as if they were pins pushed into a map of his humiliation. The agent opened one folder and turned it toward Langston. It displayed a scanned page of the behavior observation report written by the steward who had initiated the first protocol breach. Next to the steward's name was a notation: unauthorized use of secondary classification protocol. Below it were two red underlines beneath the phrase preemptive passenger labeling. The next folder was flipped open. This one showed internal messages sent between crew members during the flight. Most were short, coded language with phrases like possible redirect case, escalation unconfirmed, and triangle sticker confirmed. One message, time-stamped shortly after the start of the flight, read simply, "We're pushing him through protocol now. Don't flag until mid-flight." Another, later in the chain, showed growing doubt. "He hasn't resisted. Just sits there. Not sure what we're looking for anymore." These messages were accompanied by review comments from Crestline's legal department and an annotation from the Federal Flight Oversight Office: operational abuse of evaluation discretion. Subject was never verified as non-compliant. Use of behavior modulation protocol unauthorized. Langston sat in silence. He did not flinch. The agents did not ask for clarification. They moved on to the next file. This one detailed the origin of the mistake, or, as one report called it, the initiating fracture. A newly hired scheduling clerk had misfiled Langston's identity in the pre-flight manifest system, incorrectly coding his status as evaluation eligible. The automation flagged him for minor pre-boarding delays, which then snowballed into an unchecked cycle of procedural abuse once crew members, uninformed of his protected designation, took initiative in enforcing routine passenger control drills. But it was more than a clerical error. The system had failed at every level: unquestioned assumptions, unchecked authority, blind trust in process. Langston had been reduced to an object because the system allowed it. One of the agents paused and looked directly at him. "Do you want to file a formal misconduct claim?" he asked. The words came slowly, like he had rehearsed them many times and still didn't know how they would be received. Langston shook his head once. "Not yet," he said, his voice flat but steady. "Let them sit with it first." The agents nodded. No further explanation was needed. Behind the scenes, things had already begun to unravel for the crew. Berman, the steward who had initiated Langston's reassignment to provisional duties, was escorted off the plane 20 minutes after Langston's departure. His employee badge was deactivated in real time, and his crew account access was locked. His supervisor was placed on administrative review, pending a full audit of all procedural exercises conducted under his watch. J. Rowland, The attendant who had handed Langston the falsified safety card with exaggerated illustrations was placed on unpaid leave while investigators reviewed whether similar materials had been issued to other passengers in previous flights. A third attendant, the one who had overseen the mock behavioral drills, quietly resigned within the hour. The airline's crisis response team issued a temporary gag order on internal communications while a controlled media strategy was drafted. But the effort to manage the story quickly crumbled. Passengers from the flight began posting anonymously to travel forums and private chat groups, sharing vague but troubling accounts of what they had witnessed. One described it as watching someone being systematically erased. Another called it psychological dismemberment by protocol. The airline's public account tried to downplay the event as a confidential procedural anomaly involving one passenger, but the damage was already outpacing the spin. By the end of the day, an internal whistleblower leaked a fragment of Langston's passenger designation file to a transportation oversight blog. The post, titled "Ghost in Seat 34, detailed the systemic misclassification of protected passengers and questioned how many others might have endured similar treatment without the oversight mechanisms failing so publicly. The story was picked up within hours by national media outlets. Panel discussions, op-eds, and travel advocacy groups erupted across platforms, demanding accountability, transparency, and immediate review of procedural authority in mid-flight operations. The airline issued a formal statement of regret. The week after the flight passed not in the measured cadence of normal time, but in layers, each moment stacking upon the last with quiet intensity. Langston Price did not return home immediately. His mother, Maura Keaton Price, had insisted he stay under the protective reach of Crestline's internal recovery protocols, but Langston chose otherwise. He needed space, not security. He needed to walk through the world without the echo of voices measuring his worth, without surveillance cameras dissecting every movement, without barcodes pressed to his chest like a brand. So he stayed in the city near the airport, booking a room under a name not his own, and for a few days, he let silence become his companion. Outside that room, the story had ignited. The leaked documents had exposed more than procedural failure. They had cracked the illusion of impartial systems. Journalists had unearthed other passengers with similar stories, most less visible, less protected. Their narratives dismissed before they even left the aircraft. Whispers of racial profiling, of discretionary flagging, of undocumented evaluations echoed across panels and platforms. And suddenly the conversation shifted from Langston to the architecture of bias that had birthed the experience. But the part no one saw, the one Langston kept folded like the embossed letter in his jacket, was what happened to the people who had played their roles in the ritual. Not the executives, not the public, the people. Berman was the first to return. He walked into the required hearing with his head slightly bowed, his uniform replaced by a plain shirt and slacks that seemed to deflate his once confident frame. The Internal Review Board asked him to explain the justification for reassigning Langston without proper verification. Berman said nothing for a long moment, then admitted that the sticker was supposed to be harmless, a precaution only. But when pressed on why he initiated the behavioral compliance drills, he hesitated and finally said, "Because he fit the pattern." The silence that followed was colder than judgment. It was understanding and disappointment. Berman was dismissed from his position, barred from in-flight supervisory roles indefinitely. But it didn't end there. Weeks later, he was seen at a small airport in Nebraska, working as ground crew, checking inventory in silence. One of his former colleagues approached him and asked why he hadn't fought the dismissal. Berman didn't answer right away. Then he said, "He looked right at me, and I knew he saw everything." That was enough. The others, those who had watched, followed, obeyed without question, were offered retraining instead of termination. Crestline's board, recognizing the endemic nature of the problem, approved a sweeping revision of their training protocols. They no longer used terms like passenger management or escalation potential. Instead, they introduced a model called presence integrity, focused not on predicting compliance, but on preserving dignity regardless of status, race, or behavior. J. Rowland took the course. It was voluntary for those not facing direct censure, but he signed up before the email was even circulated. On the first day, the instructor asked participants to write down the worst decision they'd made on the job. Roland wrote 7. He folded the paper in half and handed it in without waiting to be asked. During a mock scenario halfway through the training, he interrupted the exercise and said aloud, "We don't need another drill. We need to start with how we look at people when no one's watching." The instructor paused. For the rest of the session, they talked not about procedure, but perception. And then there was Marla, the attendant who had placed the compliance packet in Langston's lap and walked away. She wasn't fired. She wasn't even formally reviewed. But she changed. She requested a transfer to ground service at a regional airport far from mainline operations. When a colleague asked her why, she said, "Because I need to learn how to greet people again." Months later, passengers stepping off small commuter flights were surprised to see her at the gate, holding a sign not with names, but with words. "Welcome. You belong here." Langston didn't follow their stories. He didn't have to. He lived in the space their change created. And slowly, that space widened. Crestline's executive board held a summit, inviting activists, transportation officials, and people whose voices had been silenced by bureaucracy for too long. Maura Keaton-Price spoke there not as a mother, but as a professional who had trusted a system that failed her son. She opened with 5 words, "My name is Maura Price." Then she let the room breathe. "My son flew in silence. And because of that silence, you now speak. Let that cost mean something." Across terminals, new protocols emerged, not the kind that were printed on emergency cards, but those etched into culture. Flight crews were trained to see before they judged, to wait before they labeled, to recognize the damage that lives in assumptions. Every barcode sticker was reviewed. Every provisional reassignment required justification and oversight. And every jump seat was treated as a seat, not a corner for control. Langston returned home 6 weeks after the flight. He walked through the door of his mother's house, carrying nothing but the jacket he had refused to return. She didn't speak. She just stood there as he laid it gently on the kitchen table, the green sticker still tucked into the pocket. Then she took his hand and led him outside, where a group of high school students waited under a canvas awning. She had invited them without telling him. Young people, many who had never flown before, others who had, but had returned with stories they didn't know how to voice. Langston sat with them. He didn't give a speech. He didn't lecture. He just listened. And when one girl, no older than 16, whispered that she had been pulled from line last summer because they said her name didn't match her face, he nodded and said, "That happened to me too." In that moment, the end wasn't vengeance. It wasn't public disgrace or personal revenge. It was connection, shared experience. The slow stitching of a community once torn apart by quiet prejudices and polished systems designed to erase pain through procedure. Langston never became a symbol. He remained a person, a young man who had walked through a machine built to measure behavior and emerged with a deeper understanding of how fragile power can be when it rests on unspoken bias. The last time he boarded a plane, months later, the crew smiled and offered him a seat near the front. He accepted it. But before sitting, he walked to the rear, stood for a moment near the lavatory, and placed a folded note on the empty jump seat. It read, "This seat once taught me how invisible I could become, but it also reminded me who I am. May it now remind you what not to forget." The end. If you're still reading, thanks for sticking with the story. Your time means everything. If you felt the weight of this journey, or if it made you think, consider liking or subscribing to follow future chapters and powerful narratives like this one. I'm curious to know what you think about the plot so far. Which moment hit hardest for you? Which character arc stood out? Also, let me know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment and share your thoughts. I read every one. Your feedback shapes what comes next.